A serious injury today means an ambulance, an X-ray, and a nurse asking you to rate your pain from 1 to 10 while you quietly reconsider every decision that led you here. 50,000 years ago, there was no ambulance, no antiseptic, no antibiotics, not even a suspiciously expensive hospital sandwich. So a shattered arm, a cracked skull, or a deep hunting wound should have been a death sentence. Except prehistoric skeletons keep ruining that assumption. Archaeologists have found ancient bones that were broken, displaced, sometimes violently damaged, and then healed. Not barely. Some people survived for years after injuries that would have left them unable to hunt, travel, or defend themselves, which means someone fed them. Someone protected them, and someone may have known how to clean wounds, set bones, reduce pain, and stop infection without understanding what bacteria even were. So how did ancient humans survive serious injuries? The answer begins before medicine, before surgery, and possibly before our species with one astonishing survival tool: other people. Before anyone could treat a broken bone, humans first had to solve a more fundamental problem: staying alive while temporarily useless. For most animals, a serious injury is not merely painful. It is an eviction notice from the food chain. A predator that cannot chase goes hungry. Prey that cannot run becomes lunch. Even a relatively minor wound can make finding water, maintaining body temperature, or escaping danger nearly impossible. Early humans faced the same biological rules, but they had discovered a loophole: cooperation. Humans and earlier members of our genus lived in social groups where food could be shared, threats could be confronted collectively, and an injured person did not have to perform every survival task alone. Someone else could carry water. Someone else could bring meat. Someone else could maintain the fire, while the patient contributed by lying near it and trying not to invent screaming as a formal language. Fire was especially important. It provided warmth to people who could no longer move enough to regulate their body temperature. It kept predators at a respectful distance. It softened food for individuals with damaged teeth or weakened bodies, and it created a relatively stable place where an injured person could remain while the group continued gathering resources. Shelter mattered for the same reason. Recovery requires time, and time is difficult to obtain when rain, cold, insects, and large carnivores are all competing to finish what the original accident started. A protected camp turned healing from a desperate biological gamble into something the body actually had a chance to complete. But the greatest prerequisite was social tolerance. Caring for an injured group member consumed calories, attention, and energy. In a small prehistoric community, those resources were never unlimited. Feeding someone who could not currently hunt meant everyone else accepted a slightly smaller share. Protecting them could slow the group's movement. Remaining nearby might even expose everyone to danger. And yet healed injuries show that ancient people sometimes made exactly that choice. This was not necessarily charity in the modern sense. An injured hunter might recover. An older person who could no longer chase animals could still remember water sources, migration routes, tool-making techniques, or which mushroom caused dinner to become a religious experience. Knowledge had survival value, and human communities were beginning to store that knowledge inside people. So the first hospital was not a building. It was a social agreement made around a fire. Today, you cannot help us survive, but we will help you survive anyway. Long before humans had medicine cabinets, they had something almost as useful: the ability to watch what happened after doing something questionable. Prehistoric healing probably began through repeated accidents rather than a single brilliant discovery. Someone pressed a hand against a bleeding cut and noticed that pressure slowed the blood. Someone rested an injured leg against a branch and discovered that keeping it still made it hurt less. Someone covered a wound with mud or clay, perhaps for cooling or protection, and occasionally survived long enough for the group to remember the result. This was not science in the modern sense. There were no controlled trials, written records, or warning labels. There was simply observation, memory, and an alarming number of volunteers who had not volunteered. Animals may also have offered clues. Chimpanzees and other species have been observed swallowing rough leaves, eating bitter plants, or applying biological materials when sick or injured. Ancient humans were skilled observers of animal behavior because their lives depended on predicting where animals moved, what they ate, and what they avoided. Watching a wounded animal chew a particular plant would not automatically reveal a medicine, but it might inspire experimentation. Then came trial and error. A bitter bark reduced pain. A certain leaf seemed to calm swelling. Clay absorbed moisture and formed a hard shell around an injured limb. Plant fibers could bind a wooden splint in place. Cool water cleaned away visible dirt, while warmth near the fire helped an injured person avoid hypothermia. None of this required knowledge of cells, microbes, or inflammation. It required only the recognition that one action produced a better outcome than another. Of course, prehistoric experimentation came with a rather severe peer review process. A useful plant might ease pain. A similar-looking plant might cause vomiting, hallucinations, or a very educational funeral. Knowledge, therefore, had to be remembered and shared carefully. Which bark could be chewed? Which leaves belonged on wounds? Which root helped, and which root made the patient begin negotiating with the moon? Over generations, isolated discoveries could become traditions. The person who remembered plants, prepared bindings, or successfully repositioned an injured limb would become valuable to the group. Skill may have blended with ritual, because the biological causes of illness remained invisible. A treatment could involve practical wound care, symbolic gestures, spoken charms, and a great deal of confidence. But confidence does not leave marks on skeletons. Healing does. And buried inside ancient bones, archaeologists have found evidence that some of these experiments worked. Bones are terrible storytellers. They provide no dialogue, no eyewitnesses, and absolutely no respect for chronological suspense. But when bone is injured and the person remains alive, it begins recording the recovery. A fracture that occurred near death usually keeps sharp, unfinished edges. A fracture that healed during life develops new bone around the break. The longer the person survived, the more remodeling appears. It is the skeletal equivalent of a timestamp, except the timestamp says, "This was catastrophic, and somehow I kept going." Few individuals demonstrate this better than Shanidar I, a Neanderthal discovered in Shanidar Cave in present-day Iraqi Kurdistan. He survived crushing damage around his left eye, likely losing much of his vision. His right forearm and hand were missing, his leg was impaired, and abnormalities in his ear canals may have caused substantial hearing loss. Yet he lived into older adulthood. That is difficult to explain as one lucky afternoon. A person with reduced vision, hearing, mobility, and only one functional hand would have struggled to hunt large animals, escape predators, and perform many everyday tasks alone. His survival does not reveal exactly what his companions did, but it strongly suggests sustained social support. Someone shared food. Someone adjusted the group's behavior. Someone looked at a badly injured Neanderthal and decided he was still one of them. Then there is a skeleton from Liang Tabo Cave in Borneo dating to at least 31,000 years ago. The lower portion of the individual's left leg was absent, and researchers interpreted the bone changes as evidence of deliberate surgical amputation during childhood. Even more astonishingly, the person appears to have survived for another 6 to 9 years. Removing a limb without modern equipment means controlling catastrophic bleeding, avoiding fatal shock, and somehow preventing infection in a tropical environment where microbes were presumably working overtime. There is scientific debate about whether trauma could explain the missing limb, but the surgical interpretation presents a remarkable possibility. Sophisticated anatomical knowledge existed far earlier than once believed. Prehistoric skulls provide another disturbing clue. Trepanation involved scraping, cutting, or drilling an opening into the skull. On many examples, the edges show substantial healing, proving that the procedure was performed on living people who survived afterward. Why it was done remains uncertain. It may have treated head trauma, pain, seizures, or spiritual problems. Possibly all four. These bones cannot tell us the healer's name or technique, but they reveal something almost as important. The patient lived. For all the remarkable evidence archaeologists have uncovered, the most honest answer to many questions about prehistoric medicine is still a deeply scientific. We're not entirely sure, and that uncertainty is actually part of the story. Take medicinal plants, for example. It's tempting to imagine a prehistoric healer confidently handing out herbal remedies with the bedside manner of an experienced family doctor. The reality was almost certainly messier. While chemical analyses of ancient dental plaque and archaeological sites suggest that some prehistoric humans consumed plants with known medicinal properties, proving intent is incredibly difficult. Did they eat willow bark because it eased pain? Because it was available? Or because someone thought it tasted surprisingly decent after 3 days without food? The evidence rarely tells us. The same uncertainty surrounds infection. Modern medicine understands that invisible microorganisms cause disease. Prehistoric humans did not, yet they may have discovered practical ways to reduce infection simply by observing results. Washing wounds with clean water, removing dead tissue, covering injuries with fresh plant material, or keeping patients away from contaminated waste could all improve survival without anyone understanding why. Experience often arrives long before explanation. Then there are the shamans. Nearly every traditional society recorded in history includes individuals who combined healing, ritual, and spiritual leadership. Archaeologists suspect similar figures may have existed deep into prehistory, but skeletons cannot identify professions. A burial cannot label someone as village doctor. At best, unusual grave goods or repeated evidence of specialized practices allow cautious interpretation. Trepanation presents perhaps the greatest mystery of all. Hundreds of prehistoric skulls bear carefully made openings, many with clear signs of healing. That means the patients survived the procedure, sometimes for years. But the purpose remains hotly debated. Some researchers argue it relieved pressure after traumatic head injuries. Others suggest treatment for chronic pain, epilepsy, or neurological disorders. Another possibility is entirely symbolic, that opening the skull was believed to release harmful spirits responsible for illness. Oddly enough, these explanations are not mutually exclusive. A healer might have genuinely believed evil spirits caused headaches while accidentally reducing dangerous intracranial pressure after a severe injury. Good outcomes do not always require correct theories. History is full of people reaching useful conclusions for reasons that modern science would politely describe as creative. Perhaps the biggest debate concerns compassion itself. Were injured individuals cared for out of empathy? Family loyalty, mutual obligation, practical self-interest. Evolutionary biologists continue to debate where altruism ends and survival strategy begins. Helping an injured hunter today might mean that hunter helps you survive next winter. Caring for grandparents preserved decades of ecological knowledge that no one else possessed. Cooperation and compassion may never have been separate evolutionary forces. They likely evolved together, each making the other stronger. In other words, prehistoric healing wasn't simply about fixing broken bodies. It was about building communities where survival became something people shared. Once a treatment works more than once, it stops looking like luck. It becomes knowledge. That change may have transformed prehistoric healing from an improvised response into a recognized social role. In small communities, the person who remembered how to bind a fracture, prepare a useful plant, or clean damaged tissue would become extremely valuable. Their experience could be taught, repeated, and refined. Medicine did not need textbooks yet. It needed memory. And preferably a healer who did not confuse the pain-relieving root with the root that made everyone see glowing mammoths. Over generations, practical treatment likely became intertwined with ritual. Illness and injury were frightening, partly because their causes were often invisible. A wound could appear manageable and then suddenly swell, darken, and kill someone days later. A seizure could strike without warning. Fever could seem to come from nowhere. Without germ theory or neurology, supernatural explanations were not irrational within the knowledge available. They were attempts to give chaos a cause, so the healer may also have become a ritual specialist. A treatment could involve cleaning a wound, applying plant material, chanting, smoke, touch, or symbolic objects. Modern observers sometimes separate these into real medicine and magic, but prehistoric people may not have recognized that division. The practical and spiritual parts belonged to the same act of care. One addressed the body, the other addressed fear, uncertainty, and the social meaning of suffering. That psychological dimension mattered. An injured person who believed the group had not abandoned them was more likely to remain fed, protected, and calm. Ritual gathered people around the patient and turned private pain into a shared responsibility. Even when the supernatural explanation was wrong, the social response could still improve survival. As communities expanded during the Neolithic period, healing knowledge became even more important. Farming increased population density, repetitive physical labor, interpersonal conflict, and exposure to infectious disease. Permanent settlements also allowed specialists to accumulate experience instead of constantly moving between temporary camps. Certain individuals may have become known for treating wounds, assisting childbirth, managing fractures, or performing procedures such as trepanation. Healing could also create authority. A person believed capable of restoring health held more than technical skill. They controlled rare knowledge, interpreted misfortune, and often stood between the community and forces no one else understood. Medicine, religion, and leadership began growing from the same root. Long before hospitals had white walls, they had fires, herbs, stories, and people willing to stay beside the injured. Civilization did not begin only when humans built permanent homes. It also began when they made room inside those homes for someone who could not stand. Today, surviving a serious injury can involve trauma surgeons, blood banks, antibiotics, imaging machines, rehabilitation specialists, and a billing department determined to injure you emotionally. The technology is new. The basic strategy is ancient. A modern hospital is, at its core, a highly organized version of the prehistoric campfire. It keeps vulnerable people warm, protected, fed, monitored, and surrounded by specialists, while their bodies attempt the slow biological work of repair. The machines are more impressive, the lighting is much worse, but the principle remains the same. When one person can no longer survive alone, the group temporarily carries them. That may be one of the most important things archaeology reveals about us. Human evolution is often told as a parade of weapons, tools, and increasingly clever ways to chase dinner. Sharp stones, spears, fire, bigger brains. But a species does not thrive through aggression alone. It also thrives by preserving injured hunters, aging knowledge keepers, disabled family members, and children who require years of support before becoming remotely useful. Care became a survival technology. The person with the healed fracture was not merely lucky. Their survival represents stored food, shared labor, remembered plants, guarded sleep, and repeated decisions by other people to remain nearby. Every healed ancient bone is therefore evidence of two biological processes happening at once: the body repairing itself, and the community refusing to let that body disappear. Of course, prehistoric medicine was limited. Many injuries still caused unbearable pain, permanent disability, or death. Treatments could fail. Useful remedies could exist beside harmful superstition. Survival was never guaranteed. But it was no longer impossible. The greatest medical breakthrough may not have been the first splint, herbal paste, or hole carefully cut into a skull. It may have been the moment humans understood, however instinctively, that another person's suffering was a problem worth solving. That decision still echoes every time someone calls an ambulance, donates blood, sits beside a hospital bed, or helps a stranger stand. So yes, 50,000 years ago, a broken leg could end your life. Unless someone stayed, and apparently someone often did.